to our last speaker.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jake Parker. I'm professional staff on the Select Committee on Competition with the CCP, working for the Republican side. It's always fun to go last because you can kind of key off of everyone's remarks. So I'll just maybe make a couple of comments on what we do and maybe follow up on some of the things that my colleagues have said. First of all, a little bit of an overview on the Select Committee. So we were set up by Speaker McCarthy at the beginning of this Congress to create a coordinated effort across committees of jurisdiction to look at our competitive posture with the CCP and with China more generally. Over the last 2 years, we've had some wins. You may have seen some of the work that we did on TikTok, which has ultimately culminated in legislation that would require the company to be sold or divested from the United States. We've also moved forward legislation called Biosecure that would restrict certain Chinese certain Chinese healthcare companies from being able to access domestic procurement. We also passed a bill yesterday in the House on increasing enforcement resources criminally to the DOJ for the enforcement of U.S. trade crimes. One of the key takeaways from our committee is our December econ report. And I would just highlight kind of one bipartisan consensus that the group came to, and that was this idea of decoupling or de-risking, which we hear about frequently from our colleagues abroad, that this is something that China has been doing with the United States for the last 2 decades since they joined the World Trade Organization, whether it's restricting investment in the PRC without joint ventures, whether it's committing to liberalize its financial services and ensuring that American credit card companies receive the licenses they need to operate in the China market. The commitments that China has made to the United States and to the world over the past 2 decades have not been faithfully implemented. And as a result of that, the committee came on a bipartisan basis to the conclusion that granting China most favored nation status or permanent normal trade relations status was a mistake that did not lead to the economic or political outcomes that were expected when it was first pitched to the public. As a result, we put together about 150 recommendations, which I won't go through, of course, on how we can better compete with the PRC. I just wanted to respond on something that Mr. Kaplan said at the beginning, and this is on some of the actions taken by the Trump administration in the first term. The 301 tariffs, right? They were implemented fairly strategically. They accelerated over time. The key takeaway that I would take from those efforts is based on the only government study of the tariffs on the United States put together by the International Trade Commission. For every 1% increase in tariffs, we saw a 2% reduction in imports in quantity and value from the PRC. If your focus is on securing supply chains and ensuring that you have an able supply of the goods that you need for your own defense industrial base, the 301 tariffs were a resounding success. The report also indicated that the tariffs had no appreciable impact on inflation, and that came about as a result of various policy decisions by this current administration, as well as because of the pandemic. China also committed to a Phase 1 agreement with President Trump. I would note that it has not been faithfully implemented. They committed to $200 billion in purchases of U.S. agricultural products. Those were not made. They also committed to structural reforms domestically, which have continued, but not at the pace at which they had committed. And I would also note the USMCA, obviously renegotiated under the previous administration. That sets 75% rules of origin to ensure that content that comes into the United States be made in Mexico, Canada, or the United States, at least for the auto industry, and that 75% of those components come from the United States or USMCA countries. As Mr. Kaplan said, President Biden continued President Trump's 301 tariffs. However, the problem is that he's continued those tariffs primarily on finished goods. The supply chain is much more complex than just the final input, which is the permanent magnet. You obviously have to look at rare earth oxides. You have to look at the mining of rare earth minerals. You can't just look at electric vehicles. You have to look at the motors that go into them. You have to look at the battery supply, whether it's the cathode active material, the constituent materials that make up that cathode active material, and where it comes from. Focusing just on the finished goods is insufficient to reduce our reliance on our foremost adversary. All right, I think I have 1 minute left, so I will just say one last thing. Congress has made clear what the intention is to the administration and for how the United States should move forward. As parliamentarians, there's constantly, obviously, some friction that you have with your various executive branches. But I would note the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed by Congress in 2022, this was a Democratic effort. But when that was published, Senator Manchin, the author of the bill, made very clear that the intention was to reduce reliance on the PRC, to create subsidies and industrial policy to ensure that American companies that have to shift their supply chains away from the PRC are appropriately compensated with various tax credits. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has implemented that policy weakened the guardrails to ensure that we continue our reliance on the PRC. This comes from what I would say is a conflict that's inherent in that if you believe that climate change is an existential threat, you are willing to do whatever you can to reduce carbon as quickly as you can. However, if you're going to accelerate that process, you have to increase your reliance on China. You can't do both at the same time. It is not possible. I think Republicans would take a more nuanced approach and recognize that it's fine that we move down a pathway of electrification. However, as we do so, we should ensure we have strong guardrails in place to ensure that Chinese companies are not being underwritten by American taxpayers for their investments in the United States. It would not surprise me in a new Congress if you were to see those guardrails tightened statutorily as well as potentially through rulemaking under a new administration. All right, that's 6 minutes. I'll stop there. Happy to engage in the Q&A. Thanks.